On July 8, 1987, in Carlsbad, New Mexico, a quiet residential street was interrupted by something that would fracture an entire family for decades. When Donna Sue Hyatt's sister, Angela, walked through the front door that day, she didn't just find a scene. She stepped into a moment that would become one of the most haunting cold cases in the region. Nothing about it looked random. Nothing about it felt complete. It was as if the story had been interrupted mid-sentence, leaving investigators with a silence that would stretch across 36 years. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back 36 years. Because this is not just a true crime story. It becomes a true crime documentary case shaped by uncertainty, memory gaps, and early investigative limits that would define one of the most enduring murder investigations in Carlsbad history. Donna Sue Hyatt was not someone defined by tragedy. She was defined by routine, the kind of everyday life that rarely makes headlines but becomes unforgettable once it's gone. In many true crime stories, it is not chaos that defines the victim first, but normalcy, the quiet structure of days that feel predictable until something breaks them apart without warning. In Carlsbad, New Mexico, Donna was known as a steady presence. She had relationships that anchored her, familiar habits that shaped her days, and a life that moved in rhythms people around her recognized. She wasn't a stranger in her own community. She was part of its fabric. And like many individuals later tied to cold cases, nothing about her daily life suggested she would become the center of a long-running murder investigation. Her world was built on familiarity. Family lived nearby, neighbors knew her routines, and even small details, like her car being seen in the same places at the same times, created a sense of stability that made her life feel grounded and safe. It was the kind of life where danger feels distant, something that happens in other places, to other people in other stories. That is what makes the shift so disturbing, because in true crime documentary cases like this, the emotional impact does not come from the violence alone, it comes from the rupture of expectation. The contrast between ordinary life and sudden, irreversible loss is where the deepest weight of these cases is carried. One moment, everything fits into place. The next, nothing does. When Angela arrived at Donna's home that day, she was not prepared for what absence could feel like when it became physical. There was no immediate explanation waiting inside, no signs that pointed clearly to what had happened. Instead, there was silence, not peaceful silence, but the kind that feels wrong the moment you step into it. Every detail she expected to find was missing in ways that were impossible to ignore. There was no sense of normal activity paused midstream, no indication that Donna had simply stepped out briefly. Instead, it felt as if life itself had been interrupted without warning, leaving behind only fragments that didn't yet form a coherent story. This is where the emotional foundation of the case truly begins, not with physical evidence, not with suspects, and not with timelines, but with absence. In many cold case investigations, absence becomes more than just what is missing. It becomes a signal, a pressure point, something investigators and families return to again and again in search of meaning. And in cases like this, absence does not fade with time, it deepens. When investigators entered the home, they immediately began treating the scene as part of a developing murder investigation, but almost immediately, they ran into a problem that would define the entire case for decades. The scene did not behave like a simple, explainable crime. It resisted interpretation. It resisted certainty. There were no clear indicators pointing to a straightforward break-in narrative, no obvious signs of forced entry that neatly supported the earliest assumptions. Instead, investigators were left with scattered details that suggested something more layered was taking place, something that would later be examined through the lens of criminal psychology and behavioral interpretation rather than direct evidence alone. And then there was the detail that changed the direction of everything: 2 used cola glasses in the living room. At first glance, it was ordinary, almost forgettable, but in a true crime documentary context, it became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire scene. Because shared items like glasses are not just objects, they are behavioral markers. They suggest interaction, they suggest presence, and most importantly, they suggest familiarity rather than forced intrusion. That single detail opened a new line of thinking. Donna may have known the person who was inside her home, or at the very least, she may have willingly allowed them into her space. In many true crime stories, it is often these small domestic details that quietly reshape the entire direction of a case. But that interpretation did not exist in isolation. It immediately clashed with early witness impressions. A clerk had reportedly described a suspect who did not appear familiar, someone who seemed more like a stranger passing through than a person with a personal connection to the victim. This contradiction became one of the first major fractures in the investigation. On one side, the physical evidence suggested familiarity. On the other, human observation suggested distance. And when criminal psychology collides with unreliable perception, investigations often enter unstable ground. As detectives worked through the early stages of the murder investigation, leads were generated quickly, but they failed to align. Each theory seemed to explain part of the scene while ignoring another critical element. One direction would account for the glasses, but not the witness statement. Another would fit the witness statement, but collapse under the physical evidence. Without modern forensic tools, no DNA comparison systems capable of rapid cross-referencing, no advanced databases to connect behavioral patterns, investigators were forced to rely on interpretation, memory, and fragmented leads. And slowly, what began as an active, urgent response began shifting into something more uncertain. Not a closed case, not a solved case, but the earliest stage of what would eventually become a cold case, defined not by lack of evidence, but by evidence that refused to agree. As months turned into years, the case of Donna Sue Hyatt settled into the uneasy reality of an unsolved cold case, not abandoned, not erased, but left in a suspended state where answers existed somewhere, just out of reach. The investigation did not disappear. It remained in circulation, pulled from archives occasionally, reviewed by different hands, and measured against whatever limited progress could be made at the time. But it was never fully revived in a way that pushed it forward. Instead, it existed in fragments, active in paperwork, but stagnant in resolution. At the center of it all, the two-glass detail never lost its weight. It remained one of the only behavioral clues embedded in the scene, a quiet but persistent indicator that suggested familiarity, even intimacy, yet refused to identify anyone with certainty. In many true crime documentary cases, it is often this kind of ambiguous evidence that keeps an investigation alive long after everything else fades. This is where many cold case investigations reach their breaking point. Not because there is no evidence, but because the evidence stops speaking clearly. It becomes disconnected from context. Names that once surfaced as possibilities slowly lose relevance. Witness memories blur. Early leads that once felt promising begin to dissolve under the pressure of time and distance. For Donna's family, time did not bring resolution. It created rhythm without relief. Each year marked another anniversary of absence. Another reminder of unanswered questions that reset rather than resolved. The emotional weight did not decrease with time. It accumulated. It layered itself across decades, becoming part of daily life rather than a moment in the past. Meanwhile, detectives who refused to quit continued to preserve what they could. Portions of the file remained active in the background, revisited when possible, kept from being fully forgotten. But the reality of the era placed hard limits on progress. Without DNA cold case advancements, without modern forensic databases capable of cross-referencing evidence at scale, investigators were forced to rely on fragmented leads, partial recollections, and investigative intuition rather than scientific confirmation. Each attempt forward required rebuilding the case from incomplete pieces, and each time the same barrier returned: lack of certainty. And so, the investigation did not end in closure. It transitioned into something far more difficult. A murder investigation that could no longer move forward, not because it was resolved, but because at that time it simply could not yet be solved. If you follow true crime documentaries, especially cold cases, murder mysteries, and investigations where detectives who refuse to quit finally find answers, subscribe to Ripple Effect Stories. We release crime documentaries posted weekly, focusing on true crime cases, cold case investigations, and stories where one moment reshaped everything. After 36 years, the case of Donna Sue Hyatt reemerged not because of a new witness or a forgotten confession, but because something fundamentally changed in how cold case investigations could be solved: modern forensic science. What once had been constrained by the limits of 1987 technology was now being re-examined through advanced DNA cold case methods. Evidence that had been carefully preserved from the original murder investigation was no longer just archived material. It became active data again, capable of producing answers that simply did not exist at the time of the original inquiry. This is the point where many true crime documentary cases shift in nature. Evidence does not change, but its meaning does. What was once static becomes readable in a completely new way. Investigators submitted the preserved biological material into modern forensic databases, but they were not only searching for a direct match. That approach alone often fails in long-dormant cases. Instead, they expanded the scope, looking for familial connections, genetic overlaps, and indirect relational links that could point toward a broader family line. This is where criminal psychology and forensic science intersect in a unique way. Psychological patterns may fade, witness memory may distort, and timelines may become unreliable, but biological evidence remains unchanged. It does not interpret, it does not forget, it simply connects. Gradually, the results began to narrow the field of possibilities. What had once been a completely unsolved cold case investigation started to take shape again, not as a finished answer, but as a narrowing corridor of likelihoods. At first, there was no name attached, only direction, only structure, only the slow reappearance of possibility where none had existed for decades. Each comparison eliminated another branch of uncertainty. Each database search removed another false lead. What had once felt like a frozen investigation, sealed in time and distance, began to respond again, piece by piece, as modern science reintroduced movement into a case that had been still for most of a generation. And this is what defines a true turning point in cold case investigations. It is not a single dramatic revelation. It is a chain reaction of confirmations, each one small on its own, but together forming something undeniable. Slowly, carefully, and with the weight of decades behind it, the past stopped being unreachable, and for the first time in 36 years, the case began to move forward again. The resolution of Donna Sue Hyatt's case came not from memory, but from science, DNA cold case analysis that finally closed a 36-year gap in one of Carlsbad's most enduring cold cases. But closure in true crime stories is never limited to a verdict. It spreads outward. For Donna's family, it meant the end of waiting, but not the end of impact. Decades had been spent living inside an unanswered question. That absence becomes part of identity. For the community, it reinforced how cold case investigations can evolve, proving that time does not erase accountability, it only delays it. And for the justice system, it became another example of how detectives who refused to quit, combined with advancing forensic science, can eventually rewrite what once seemed unsolvable. This is the ripple effect, one event in 1987, echoing through decades of emotional, legal, and scientific consequence. This case is a reminder that one moment can echo across decades, shaping families, investigations, and entire communities. If this story moved you, subscribe to Ripple Effect Stories, where we uncover true crime documentary cases, cold case investigations, and the stories where everything changed in a single moment.